Welcome back, class. I have some Japanese tea for today's session, appropriate for the film that we'll be watching this week. So let's jump into this. Animation. Okay, so what is animation? The definition of animation is literally to bring something to life. So when Frankenstein monster is brought to life, he is being animated from the dead to be living. So that's something peculiar and interesting about animated film, is quite literally bringing something into life that did not exist before. But we have to think about, what does animated film do that's different than live action film? These days most films are a little bit of a hybrid. Even something like Mad Max, which uses a lot of CGI or Avatar, theoretically are not animations, but a lot of what you see on screen is actually created on computers. But in any case, what we're mostly going to focus on is the type of animation that's hand-drawn or in that kind of form. So there's a couple terms you need to become a little bit familiar with to just understand what is unique about animation. First is this concept of setting. So setting is the involves leveling, which is how much detail do you have. And that level of detail is really important, because if you range on the more stylistic side, like let's say with Peanuts versus Superhero, you have a range of psychological psychological responses, and we'll get to that in a minute. But in any case, leveling has to do with the level of detail that we have. And then in terms of characters, this idea of assimilation, and to what extent are the characters exaggerated and to what effect. So usually assimilation in its more extreme form is used to exaggerate certain stereotypes. So if we go to Scott McCloud's theories about comic books, he argues very interestingly that if you have a more detailed image, such as the one on the left here, that the viewer has a tendency to participate and think less and imagine less, because it's doing the thinking for you. If you move across the spectrum to the farthest right, where here, let me move this, you see a more abstract face, although there's enough information there that we know it's a face. The more abstraction there is, the more you're able to project yourself into the image. So let's go to this pyramid of reality versus abstraction. And you can see that any kind of image, like on the far left, that is more realistic, it involves less closure. You don't have to fill in any information. And the more you move to the right with language or abstraction, the more you can imagine. And this is why kids like this kind of animation, because kids can picture themselves, because they're more imaginative, I suppose. They can actually place themselves within the images. Excuse me. So how does this relate to animated film? Well, let's talk a little bit about Disney, because Disney does a little bit of both. One thing that you'll recognize from the Disney style is the big heads and the big eyes, and which has been likened to basically oversized version cuddly animals, but also overly sized infants. Who else has big heads and big eyes and small bodies but babies? So initially those designs were there to attract children, and the simplicity of the drawing style that Disney uses allows the viewers to project themselves into those images. And you'll see here anime, which is the Japanese form of animation, borrowed heavily from this Disney idea. That's why in anime you see humans with these big eyes and large heads. Well, that was directly appropriated from the technique that was developed by Disney. So here I have some examples on this slide of some different Disney characters and animals, and then this anime figure. And that's interesting to note for our discussion about Princess Mononoke, which we'll get to in the second video. But you can see that one thing that Studio Ghibli, which is the home of all the Miyazaki films, that there is a strong influence from Disney in terms of stylistically, in terms of the eyes, the face. But there's another thing that I want you to pay attention to is if you look on the left at Bambi, which is the sort of quintessential Disney animated film, you'll notice that the characters in the forefront are very simplistic. Simplistic in the sense, like I mentioned with the Scott McCloud example. There's very little detail, but the backgrounds are highly detailed. So why is that? It's because, in theory, the idea is that the backgrounds resemble more of a real world, but the animated characters are more fantastical. So the viewer can psychologically project themselves and enter into that realistic world and place themselves there so that we can sort of imagine ourselves as these characters that we see that are being drawn, such as these animals in Bambi. And Japanese borrowed also very heavily from this technique, especially the Studio Ghibli. So when we watch Princess Mononoke, you'll notice that there's a similar approach. You have very detailed, beautiful matte backgrounds, but the foreground or the characters are less detailed. That's because they're intended to be stylistically very simplified in order for us to project ourselves into that. Okay, another comment I want to make about animation is the influence of the modernist aesthetic. So if you see on the right side here, this film still, this was one of the very first animations ever made by Winsor McCoy, Little Nimoy. Animation has a particular aesthetic characteristic that comes out of modernity. So the first point would be the rejection of realism and a sense of revolution and excitement. So if you think about like painting before modernity, painting was very realistic. We didn't have photography, so painting served the role of trying to imitate reality. But then once photography came around, painters were freed up. We think about the Impressionists, the French Impressionists in particular. They become increasingly more abstract. They feel free from having to represent reality. Well, animation continues that, this idea that they don't have to represent reality. They can represent it, and they can create it in new ways, new imaginative ways that didn't exist. So the other point I want to make about animation, which is very close to the modernist aesthetic, is that it's artificial. So modernity is characterized by mechanical reproduction, and animation is clearly, obviously artificial. When we watch it, we know that it's being drawn or produced on a computer. It's not trying to imitate reality the way that a normal film would, or the way that photography would. Its constructedness is very present. But if you want to apply like postmodernist ideas, it also creates a simulacrum. It creates a virtual reality, so to speak. The next point, representation, not presence. So one of the things that differentiates like a drawing from a photograph is that in a drawing, you can create anything that you imagine. But in a photograph or a film, if you want to say have a photograph of a horse, you need to actually have a horse. But if you want to draw a horse or imagine a horse, all you have to do is represent it any way you want. So that's something that's particular about animation. And the last point is animation is obviously a product of technology. So I don't know about you, but one thing that I often experience when I watch animated films is this constant wow factor, like, aha, oh my God, how did they do that? That's so amazing. You're always thinking about the technology that went into making the animation. It's always foregrounded. Okay, so moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the reading, especially the one by Murray and Heumann, where they talk about environ tunes, and they talk extensively about this one particular 7-minute animated short called Lumberjerks. So I'm going to ask you to pause right now, pause this video, and down below I have put a link to Lumberjerks. I would like you to watch it. If we were in class, I would show it to you. It's only 7 minutes. So do that now, pause, and we'll be right back. Okay, now that you've watched Lumberjerks, let's talk a little bit about it and what Murray and Heumann have to say. So I think they give this example because it's a very good example of kind of the ambivalent approach that animators took towards the environment. Because what's interesting about this short is that on the one hand it's showing us the destruction of the forest and the habitat of these particular squirrels, and they go on this journey to recover their house and to bring it back to their forest. But what happens is that it gets reconfigured so that the tree, which was natural at the beginning, is turned into furniture, a television, and all these things. And so on the one hand, they're upset about the destruction of their home, but on the other hand, they're in a way excited now that they have their new house, and they can't wait to get electricity so they can watch TV. So there's this kind of irony about, on the one hand, the loss of the destruction of their habitat, but on the other hand, the celebration of the reformulation of the habitat into a domestic setting, which represents kind of the ideal of the 1950s of the suburban reality. So one of the points they make in discussing this cartoon, but also in animation in general, is that animation allows us to see the environment differently. So through these different techniques of caricature and leveling and assimilation, the environment can be simplified, stylized. It can show it to us in different sort of exaggerated forms. So it allows us to defamiliarize the environment, to see it in a different way. One thing that they talk about is that there is this sensibility, especially in American animation, that there's a feeling of a loss of innocence that's prevalent throughout. So even though the animated films will range from an anthropocentric to ecocentric, even the anthropocentric films, which I think Lumberjerks is, still has a sense of a loss of innocence, sort of a loss of Eden, a loss of nature through the process of modernity. There's also quite an extensive discussion about Disney animation and then Fletcher Studios, which you may or may not know about. Fletcher Studios was one of the major competitors of Walt Disney in the 1930s and 40s. You may have seen Betty Boop cartoons, which are an example of the Fletcher Studio product. And there's important to talk about their differences. And I've also put another video on the class website that you should take a look at, which is Mr. Bug Goes to Town. It's linked below, so you should also take a little look. I put a preview, which is the first couple minutes of the film, and then the whole full feature if you are brave and you want to watch the whole thing. So to talk about the difference between Fletcher Films and Disney, let's take a minute to talk first about Disney. So one of the things that Henry Giraud, a critical theorist from Canada, talks about is the role that animation plays as a form of pedagogy, that animation teaches us about how the world works, and especially for kids, because kids consume more animation than adults, and this is in many ways the first lessons they're getting about the world. And so one of the things that Giraud wrote a lot about was the powerful lessons of Disney, and I'm sure all of you have studied how Disney has impacted attitudes about gender, with the princess myths and all that. But we can also think about human and nature relations as being a common theme that is also promoted in Disney films. The difference between Disney and the Fletcher brothers, so at this point, why don't you go ahead and pause the video and just watch the first minute or two of Mr. Bug Goes to Washington, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that. So ready? Pause. Okay, welcome back. So the the Disney orthodoxy stresses narrative and folklore. In other words, taking popular or folkloric stories and animating them, but they're more interested in the stories than the animation themselves. Even though Disney animation is amazing, they're really very story-centric. Whereas Fletcher Brothers are more about the animation and less about the story. So they want to wow us with their gags and their comedy. They're very physical, and they're more along the lines of the modernist aesthetic that we talked about. So one thing we can think about Disney is sort of the application of modern technology to old or ancient folk stories. And one thing that characterizes Disney, as you all probably know, is that their stories are very simplistic, or at least they were up until more recently. So the triumph of good over evil, the superiority of small town and rural values over urban values, the value of youth innocence, also the importance of valuing female domesticity versus masculine power, but also glorifying the beauty of nature. So Disney animations depict nature very beautifully, forest and landscapes, etc. So those are all characteristics of Disney. So to talk more about Disney, let's just spend a minute thinking about The Lion King. This is a film that probably a lot of you guys watched when you were kids. So I posted a video on the links below, which is a music video, The Circle of Life, which is the main song for The Lion King. So let's pause for a moment and take a look at that video. Okay, and now that you've watched that video, a couple things to observe because they're very characteristic of. First is this idea, and this goes back to last week's theme of that, Disney uses nature a lot in its videos and in its films, but it's also a major corporation that it needs to make money, and so everything it does related to the environment is also part of their business model. So the same question we can ask about The Lion King, does it valorize the environment? Yes, it does, but it also commoditizes. And if you think about all the animals, maybe you guys bought dolls for the different characters when you were kids, and there's a ton of products you could buy for The Lion King. So one of the terms that's used is spectatorial, which is the relationship between the viewer and how nature is actually fetishized. So nature is then really turned into entertainment and spectacle, kind of similar to what we talked about last week with wildlife films, but even more so with these Disney animated films. So what's interesting about the Circle of Life is, Circle of Life is a very beautiful ecological concept if you think about everything's connected, everything's related. But it's also showing us an animal utopia that does not exist. A lot of those animals in the video would eat each other or kill each other. So it kind of gives us a false view of nature that's idealized and very misleading, perhaps. Another danger of this approach is that it makes nature more colorful and more vibrant than it really is, and that maybe kids or adults, when they grow up, would come to expect when they go out into nature to be as exciting as the animation, and they might end up being disappointed that it may not be as thrilling or interesting as the animation. Okay, so we're almost done. I want to talk about, in particular, Bambi and Finding Nemo, which are probably the other most famous animated films about wildlife that Disney produced. And both are about anthropomorphized animals, which means that animals that are made to be like humans. That, in other words, Bambi, who is a baby deer, also speaks English and is like a human baby. And then in Finding Nemo, of course, we have a family of clownfish, a mother and a lost son, and then all the various different animals or fish in Finding Nemo are of course anthropomorphized. An interesting question is, which film is more ecological? What you may not know, I don't know how many of you saw Bambi or remember it, but Bambi is actually very anti-human. If you think about it, who are the evil characters in Bambi? Well, they're the humans. They're the hunters. They're the ones who start the fire, burn the forest, and which is very interesting. Might be even surprising. The problem is that it reinforces this boundary that we keep coming back to between this idea of nature and this idea of humanity. So humanity is sort of like the original sin that destroys the environment, and then there's the beautiful, idealized environment separate from humanity in its own sort of timeless reality. And Bambi basically reinforces that boundary, this boundary between the human world and the animal world, that they cannot coexist. Finding Nemo is a different case study because what's interesting about Finding Nemo is that it, first of all, creates kind of like it makes the fish world like the human world. Like there's a school, it's like this suburban reality, but it also, I think, shows us that there are some good humans, and I think that there was one of the byproducts of Finding Nemo was that it created more empathy and for coral fish, and it brought a lot of awareness about the endangered coral reefs and raised a lot of awareness. So it had a kind of a different impact than Bambi. Sadly, a lot of kids wanted to buy clownfish, and they ended up flushing them down the toilet. So that was sort of an unintended consequence of the popularity of that film. Okay, last slide. So this anthropomorphism has a double-edged sword. So by making the characters in the case of Finding Nemo human-centric, in other words, that the fish have the same desires as humans, the mother needs to find her child. On the one hand, it's changing nature into something that it's not. It's making it into sort of this human world. But on the other hand, it's giving us a reality that we can identify with, that maybe it would cause us to identify with their plight and their reality because they're kind of like us. So I think that there might be some benefit to that. The animation is very exaggerated. I mean, I put the picture here of the coral reef in Finding Nemo, and you will not find a coral reef in the real world that looks like that. It's a very technicolor, exaggerated reality that does not exist in the actual natural world. But it does defamiliarize us with the environment. It gets us to look at it differently, to think about it differently. So that's maybe a benefit of these animations. However, this hyperrealism creates an idealized, timeless, outside of time paradise, and overly simplified characters and utopian reality that does not match the actual natural world would at least teach kids something about nature that would be false, and that they would have the wrong idea about how the natural world at least, actually functions. The last point I want to make is, which comes up in the readings, is that nature is portrayed as either sublime being something that invokes awe, or a frontier, a place to be conquered. So the frontier theme came up in previous weeks, in particular when we talked about car films and the idea of the West and the Western. And so you see that in the Lumberjerks cartoon, that the nature is a frontier that modernity is encroaching upon. In the case of most Disney films, nature tends to be more sublime. It tends to be absent of humans. So it has that reinforced boundary between humans and nature. Okay, well, let's stop there. I will post another video later about Princess Mononoke specifically. So for now, see you in the Moodle discussion forum. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you soon.